Andrea, and thank you all for having me here today. I hope you enjoy this presentation about Native American horticulture to 1492. I'm going to start reading to you from pilgrims and their accounts of what the land looked like when they arrived in the 1620s into New England. This is from Martin Pring, whose account of Martha's Vineyard goes this way. As for the trees, the country yieldeth sassafras, a plant of sovereign virtue for the French pots, and as some of late have learnedly written, good against the plague and many other maladies. Vines, cedars, oaks, ashes, beeches, birch trees, cherry trees, bearing fruit whereof we did eat, hazels, witch hazels, the best wood of all to make soap ash with, maples, holly to make birdlime with, and a kind of tree bearing a fruit like a small red pear plum. And Pring was astonished to see this. And then you go on another page or two here, and we have two. Sorry, my page numbers are not something. There we are. There it is. And so William Wood, around Boston, a few years later, in the 1630s, wrote, "The timber of the country grows straight and tall, some trees being 20, some 30 feet high before they spread forth their first branches." And that was completely shocking. So Pring and Wood both expected to find a forest primeval, a Garden of Eden, a place that had not been touched by human beings. But of course, there had been about 130 million human beings living in what's today Mexico, the United States, and Canada, just 100 years before. When Wood and Pring were writing in the 1620s and 30s, there were less than 1 million in what becomes the United States. There had been a decimation. 90% of the population had died in a century. And everything that they had done to create their environment in a man-made fashion had been left to sit. The Pilgrims and the Puritans didn't understand that what they were seeing was not a virgin land, they were seeing a widowed land. A land that had been forsaken by civilizations that had worked it for centuries, who suddenly disappeared from the earth. And their astonishment continued. Let me go forth another page here. Thomas Morton, in the 1630s, described spruce trees in the cold northern woods that measured as much as 20 feet around. And John Johnstown mentioned that some were so big that no ship could carry them. Another wrote that the average height of a mature grove might be well over 100 feet, with a few trees as much as 5 feet in diameter and 250 feet in height. This is in the eastern seaboard, not on the west coast, in the 17th century. Let's see here, another one. I'm going to do it number 5. I can't find it, so let's go 6 and 7. So here, a bunch. About the animals and the game about them. The abundance of sea fish, wrote the Reverend Francis Higgins in 1630, are almost beyond believing. And sure, I should scarce have believed it except I had seen it with my own eyes. Brighton described how in a few hours of fishing, he and his companions had been pestered on our ship with so many codfish that we threw numbers of them overboard again. Cape Cod came to be named as a result of such experiences. William Wood described the arrival of alewives in such multitudes as is almost incredible, pressing up shallow waters as will scarce permit them to swim. So thick that the fish become in some streams that at least one inhabitant fancied he might have walked on the backs of these fish without getting his feet wet. John Johnstown had no illusions about crossing streams on the backs of fish, but he was sure that he could have walked knee-deep through stranded herring across a quarter-mile of beach. Nothing in their English experience had prepared these men for the sight of such prodigious quantities of fish. Why so many fish? Indians had been fishing these rivers and these streams for thousands of years, and all of a sudden disappeared. And the fish came back in huge numbers, right, with no one to take them. Same thing with those trees. Why were they so big and tall? Why were their branches 20, 30 feet tall before they'd sprout the first branch? Because they had been farming this land. They were seeing meadows. They were seeing parks. And their style of farming was so much different. than what Europeans were used to. Europeans go in and they tear down trees, and they rip out stumps, and they build big, wide open fields, and they build fences around them. That's what a European was expecting to find. But here, they found places that looked like parks. They found rivers and streams teeming with fish because people had just suddenly disappeared. Beyond that, the same was true for the region's birds. If I should tell you, wrote William Wood, how some have killed 100 geese in a week, 50 ducks at a shot, 40 teals at another, it may be counted as impossible. No, nothing more is certain. Thomas Morton described that they could so easily shot because the one being killed, the others just sit fast nonetheless. And this is no bad commodity. A man could kill a dozen turkeys in half a day. Why? Animals were completely immune to the sound of gunfire, right, at first. They never heard anything like that before. It might sound like thunder or what have you, right, because Indians, of course, were using firing weapons, right, to catch these things. They were using traps, they were using bow and arrow, things like that. Passenger pigeons. John Johnstown measured their numbers in the millions of billions and spoke of flocks that, to my mind and my thinking, had neither beginning nor ending, length nor breadth, and so thick that I could not see the sun. Again, why were these passenger pigeons so thick? Well, because humans hadn't been there that could cull down the numbers in about 100 years, and so getting larger and larger. For beasts, wrote Thomas Higginson, there are some bears. Also, there are several sorts of deer. Also, wolves, foxes, beavers, otters, martens, great wildcats, and a great beast they call a moose, as big as an ox. Thomas Morton found New England's deer, among which he included elk, to be larger than the English fallow deer, and regarded them as the most useful and most beneficial of the beasts in the region. And I could go on and on and on to read more of these accounts of the astonishment of these English people at finding this place. And they continued to describe it as a forest primeval. They believed that this was all created by God for them, when it had been managed by people for tens of thousands of years. We know that. Right? Tens of thousands. So that's where I wanted to start you today, to get you to understand that people first arriving here from the European continent had no idea what they were seeing. So how in the world could you, 400 years later, 500 years later, without a tremendous amount of archaeological, anthropological, and historical research, and sit through classes to learn this kind of stuff? What I'm saying is, don't feel bad. I have students all the time who come to me after a lecture or during a class on Native Americans and say, why wasn't I ever taught these things? How come? Well, we have other priorities in this country, right? We have other priorities. We want to make sure people learn math. We want to make sure that they learn, arithmetic and writing and all those sorts of things. And history has always been put at the back burner, and so much so that all we get are the highlights for in school, and just barely the highlights. So I'm going to dig a little deeper for you today to talk about North American, Native American horticulture and how it operated, how it worked, and really how it's still tied to us today. And I'll get to that later on. All right. And I'll get to this image later on, too, which is pretty astounding. So, where do Indians come from? First of all, they're not Indians, of course. They're not from the Indies directly. They're from Asia, another part, right? Maybe some came out of the Indies, who knows? But of course, they were named that by Europeans, by Spaniards, who came to what they called the New World, which wasn't new at all, at least not to the people who had been living here for 30,000 years, and assumed that they had arrived in islands off the coast of India, right, or China, somewhere in the Indies, and named them that. We use the term Native American today, which of course is just as incorrect, right? There were no native human beings in North or South America. A lot of native animals. There was a giant beaver the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. That was native to here. Horses were native to here and then left. Camels were native to here and then left. Right? So there's a lot of things that had spread across and out around the rest of the world from here, but humans were one of them. Humans came here, of course, from the Asian continent, having come out of the African continent. And they did this slide that I just made in the spring, said 25 to 32,000 years ago. Last week, an article came out in an anthropological journal by an anthropologist who saw something sticking out of his backyard, in the middle of the yard, in New Mexico. And he went out, this is 7 years ago, started digging, and he found 3 mastodon skeletons. right? One being a mother and a small infant. They radiocarbon date these things to 35 to 37,000 years ago. They had been butchered by human beings in New Mexico 36,000 years ago. Now, when I went to college, back in the 20th century, way back in the 20th century, so a long time ago, in the 1980s, I was taught that Indians came over a land bridge about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 years ago. But even then, we knew of longer, right? And so it takes a long time for this stuff out of journals to catch up with history the way we teach it. So this is just an article that came out last week. It'll be years until that makes it into a textbook. And until it makes it into a textbook, the typical teacher isn't going to teach it because they don't have time to go out and read every anthropological journal, right? So this is where we are. So now I've got to update this. 25,000 to 37,000 years ago. Actually, it's much more than that. Because it would have taken thousands of years for someone who had crossed the land bridge here from Siberia into Alaska to get all the way down and have a society, operating in what's today New Mexico. So I probably updated, say, about 40,000 years ago. It's a long time, right? And we'll talk about that in relation to other societies. But the way they came in was via land bridge. What happened is twice in the, about 18 to 24,000 years ago and 28 to 32,000 years ago, we had ice ages. When we have those ice ages, the polar ice cap expands, and as it sucks up that water, low areas are left dry. And so what happened is animals like mastodons, mammoths, and other animals started working their way across this way, and people followed them because 25 to 40,000 years ago, all human beings on the planet were hunters and gatherers. And so they followed animals. They were absolutely nomadic. There were no settlements, right? 25 to 40,000 years anywhere on this planet. So people followed these animals across, and we've developed a record of this over the last 125 years through archaeology and of course, through anthropology. As I said, too, animals were moving back the other way, right? So camels, horses, both moved right the other direction. So that's where it all comes from. And to look, we do know that very close to us, there are some really, really old Indian dwellings. So if you go out to western Pennsylvania, beyond, it's about an hour and a half from here, you'll find the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. This was a place that was discovered by a Pitt anthropologist, archaeologist, in the early 1970s, and he began to dig there. Now, when he began this dig, it was like 1971, 72, then among American archaeologists and anthropologists and historians, the line was human beings didn't get here until about 12,000, maybe 10,000 years ago. But yet, on the East Coast, in 1971, he found evidence in this rock shelter of human beings living there 15 to 17,000 years ago. So 13 to 15,000 BCE. At the time, that was the oldest known human habitation spot anywhere in the Americas until about a decade later. Thanks to his research, others began looking in the Appalachians for other rock shelters like these. And boom, 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 they start showing up. Some of these go back to 19 and 20,000 years ago, which means people crossed that land bridge at least 25,000 years ago. Up to 40, who knows, right? So right now, there's one piece of evidence. Now we've got pushed back to 37,000 years ago, which is still pretty amazing to me. So it's a dig. You can still go and see it. Adavazio, Dr. Adavazio is the archaeologist's name. He still comes and gives talks here at the site. It's still a working archaeological dig. You can go out and visit it. They've got all sorts. They've got a museum. They've got outdoor things, Indian settlement, right? Things for kids to deal with. Highly, highly recommend you go visit this place. Really, really. All right, so looks like I've lost a little bit of my. Let me raise this up a little bit. There we go. I think that slowly sinks over time, so I gotta watch it. So, emergence of horticulture. The areas in brown are the places where horticulture first began in the world. The areas in yellow are thousands of years later. So where does it begin? 10,000 years ago, we know, at the same time, people in the Fertile Crescent began to plant and grow crops and settle down and stop moving so that they could tend to their crops. At the exact same time, Native Americans were doing this in Mesoamerica, in the Amazon, which we're learning more about every day right now, where today is Peru, and then of course, Chile, and then of course in Central North America, in the eastern woodlands. At the same time that civilization, quote unquote, begins in the Fertile Crescent, it is beginning here. It's also beginning in Central and Eastern Africa. Notice, and in far east of China, right here. None in Europe for thousands of years, right? So Europe is the last to get involved in this game. So this is how it is important to understand about Native Americans, about Indians. Is they're on a similar developmental time track to people in the other parts of the world, if not ahead of men. And so here you can see those areas where horticulture began. Again, down here in Central South America, should also be here in the Brazilian rainforest. This is also pretty interesting. What we're learning now, in Brazil for the last 7 or 8 years, was it 2014, I guess? Bolsonaro became their leader, right? I can't think of his first name, but he's their leader. He came in and dismantled a lot of environmental protections and started calling for the leveling of a lot of the rainforest, for planting palm trees for palm oil and all sorts of things. And they have leveled hundreds of thousands of square miles of our planet's lungs, right, in order to grow more palm oil and to make wealth. Well, in the course of doing that, they have uncovered cities of huge scale along the river, right, in Brazil that have really revealed to us that there was a massive civilization that had grown up and had lived and had taken control of that entire Amazon River Valley, all the way up to the mountains, and that it had crossed. And what we see on the western slope of the mountains there in South America is actually the bleed over of a civilization. So the people who we see of the Incas, we believe actually now, right, started here, right, in the Amazon rainforest, which they had managed for many years. So anyway, there's our 3 areas, and we're going to start down here, even though civilizations really came to their height here in Mesoamerica. We're going to start in South America first. So here is this structure in Peru that dates to about 10,000 years ago, about 8,000 BCE. And what this tells us is that these people, 10,000 years ago, had horticulture. What does this structure tell me about horticulture? How does that tell me? Well, this is huge, right? It's more than a football field long. It's about 50 yards across, and it's about, 75 to 85 feet high. It's made of earth. It took hundreds, if not thousands of people, a decade or more to build this. Who's feeding those people? Right? If they're all doing this, who's hunting and gathering? Hunting and gathering doesn't make something like this. The only way you do something like this is with horticulture. Because one person can feed 5 through horticulture. Where if you're hunting and gathering, one feeds one. And so everybody's got to work constantly. Once you have horticulture, you've got hands to spare. And those hands and minds can learn to do other things, right? Rather than just working for sustenance all the time. And so someone had to design this structure. And so you've got people thinking about how to build large structures, and through trial and error. Then you have to have people to manage the people working it, and then you've got to have people actually working, right? So this is a huge operation that only happens if you figured out how to select seeds, the right ones, how to grow them and select again, and grow bigger and more bountiful crops that are better for you, and that you learn how to harvest, and you learn how to irrigate, and you learn how to weed, and you learn how to do all of those things that we kind of take for granted, but with no one instructing you how to do it. You've all got to just figure it out on your own. That's what people did all over the world, including here in Peru. So that's about just 10,000 years ago. This is around Lake Titicaca, and we know there are several of these structures that are 8,000 to 10,000 years old, 6,000 to 8,000 BCE. What was their horticulture? Well, one of the things that they developed were tubers, right? Potatoes, which is the ultimate Western Hemispheric food that gets exported from the Western Hemisphere. It has grown all over the world today. It keeps a lot of people alive because they're dense in calories, dense in carbohydrate, easy to grow, store, great, find a cool, dry place, right? And so that was the thing that really helped them build. But also quinoa, gourd, squash, lima beans, chili peppers. These are all things that they used in their daily diet. That was part of their horticultural scheme. If you move to about 4,000 years ago, you'll find the rise of the Mayan civilization in Mesoamerica. That's the Yucatan Peninsula. There you see the inset. So it's just south of the Yucatan there. And so the Mayans really were dozens of tribes, all in the same language family. But what you had was, over time, one tribe or another, one nation or another, would rise to ascendancy. And then they would place the others into a tributary relationship beneath them. And they did that by forming a military, and using their military, and using their government with their diplomats, right, to work out how much tribute, when would it be given, what would be the punishment if you didn't pay, right? All of that developed, again, about 4,000 years ago, as a result of horticulture moving northward, out of South America in through Mesoamerica. And so they began to build things of their own. So about 4,000 years ago, you see the first step pyramids, which were massive stone structures. And so the earthen pyramid that I showed you in Peru, what you did is you went into a river basin, you took a hand-woven basket, you dug out mud, you threw it into this basket, you took it up, you set it out, you poured it out, you let it dry, and then you blocked it. This is stone carving without metal. Right? They do all their stone carving with stones that are harder than the stones that they're carving. And so they built these massive pyramids, but then they also engage in artwork, right? And so this is also part of civilization. Having time, look at all the room we're standing, to give people the ability to do this. You've got time to think about and reflect on the world that you live in. The natural world, right? The physical world, the world of work, our pets, travel, all of those things. And that's something that horticulture gives us. It's that gift. It gives us the gift of art. It gives us the gift of beauty. It gives us the gift of religion, church, right? Organized religion comes out of horticulture. Because you can take people that would have had to work to feed everybody all the time, and you say, you know what, you go study. And you go figure out how to tend to people's spiritual needs. And all right, now you group of people, you make an order, you build a building, you do this, and all those people are out of the food game altogether, right? And so that's how that happens. And that's happening here. And so you see this artwork, which is incredible. It starts about 4,000 years ago. And you see organized religion, the building of nation states, armies, empires. Because by the time you get to 2,000 years ago, they got a real empire working. Now, here's how they started, what they started with. They developed a crop called maize. Here it is, about 4,000 years ago. And this is what it would look like 2,000 years later. So it starts like a beard of grain of wheat. It's about that big. And so they get these things like, wow, what can we do with this? Well, some of it dried, some of it powdered, add a little water to it, made a little bit of gruel, a little bit of porridge. That's not too bad, right? Took that stuff, maybe spilled some on a hot rock. Well, all of a sudden I got a pancake, right? You know, that's how you figure these things out. But you don't get much off of that. By about 3,000 years ago, it's about this size, right? By about 2,000 years ago, about that size, right? This is a little bit bigger. So this is today's typical ear of corn, right? So you go from about that to about that in about 2,000 years, and that allows you to do these kinds of things. There you get an idea of what it looked like, right? So they grow maize, right? But also beans, chilies, cacao, avocado, tomato, right? Cacao is chocolate, right? Now, you go back 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and drink the cacao that the Mayans were, you would not be able to take it, right? It is strong, strong stuff. You have to add a bunch of sugar to it and milk and other things to make it palatable to you, right? But they love the stuff. Now, it's full of caffeine, right? And so imagine taking 10 Red Bulls and pounding them down one after another. That's about a cup of that cacao. So how did they build a civilization? That's how, right? They got very, very juiced up and went on their way. Okay, so some 2,000 years ago, you start to see the building of the Mayan Empire, right? So the civilization starts about 4,000. By 2,000 years ago, you know, the power moved up here to the Olmecs, and they built an empire that controlled all of Mesoamerica by controlling other people through their civilization that they had built with governments and armies and diplomats and so on and so forth. And so the more they got tribute from their tributaries, the less food they had to create and prepare. And the less food they were responsible for, the more they could diversify their civilization. The more they had time for things like we do. Right? They built bigger temples, bigger pyramids, huge. This is the Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza. Did some of you ever see that one? Been there on vacation? Right? I'm very envious. I still haven't been there. Want to go very badly. But this is one pyramid. Like what's happening in Brazil today in the Amazon, a similar thing happened in the Mesoamerica about 20, 25 years ago. But it started more scientifically. It wasn't a bid to simply cut down trees to grow more food. What happened there was this: Google Earth. Google Earth came out in the very late 90s. And I remember being on a listserv for historians saying, hey, you can help. If you've got a few hours, start using Google Earth and scan over Mesoamerica, and anytime you see anything that looks like it has right angles, mark the GPS coordinates and send it into this website, right? I thought, oh, that's cool, so I started doing it. I found a few. I got students doing it. Thousands of us all over the country started doing this. And people began to go in and check those GPS coordinates and have found dozens and dozens of huge cities in the middle of the Yucatan jungle, really exploding our notion of the size and the power of this civilization and its horticultural output. So here is an artist rendering of what one of these found cities would have looked like at the time. And again, dozens of them. And we're talking, this is 2,000 years ago, about the time of Christ, cities that dwarfed any other collection of cities anywhere else on the planet. Right here, in our backyard, right? So, massive things. And by then, 2,000 years ago, this is what their mates look like. And notice, this is somebody alive today. These strains, which are like this, huge, are a foot and a half, right, these ears, are still being grown by Mayan people. He's a Mayan, right? By Mayan people still to this day. So that's an amazing thing. You know, next time you go to Giant Eagle, you buy corn on the cob, right? Just double the size of it, right? And that's what it is. Now, in addition to all the things I said, the Mayans by this point, I thought I had a slide in here. You know, they developed entertainment. You know, they had a written language that we've just cracked the code on within the last 2 decades. The Mayans had, they also created paper, and they wrote their language on paper and bound it in books. They had libraries. Yeah, 2,000 years ago. Books and libraries. What happened to them? Why don't we have them? Cortez came in 1517 and saw all of this civilized development and ordered every man on his expedition and those that followed not to report back to Spain what they had found. And he ordered them to burn the libraries and every book they could find. There are 5 books that were saved that still exist today. They're written by Mayans in their language, on paper. 2 of them, believe it or not, sit in a museum in Spain, which is just horrifying to Mayan people still alive today. Another sits in a library in Cuba, right? Because that was Spain's capital in the New World, Havana. So 2 others, I think one is in a museum in London and one in the United States, right? So it's crazy that this exists. But for years we didn't have the ability to read any of this language. And the language is not just in these books, but it's on these buildings. So if you've been to Chichen Itza, you saw it all over the place, right? These hieroglyphs. Well, within about 20 years ago, 17, 18 years ago, anthropologists and linguists had cracked what they believed was enough of the code to start reading it, and they have. And because of that, We now have complete history books of the development, the rise, the development, and the fall of the Mayan Empire. Because they wrote about it. You know, when Cortez arrived in 1516, the Mayans as a powerful empire had existed for 500 years. The Aztecs had already defeated them and taken over. They lived farther north, we know what's today Mexico City. But anyway, all of this done. Now, Cortez sent home that maize, right? Potatoes, beans, chilies, all of that stuff made it back to Spain, but not information about the civilized people who created it. Now, you're looking farther north into our own backyard. Also, about 2,000 years ago, you had people known as the mound builders. And they were mound building sites. We don't know what they called themselves. They have been, well, the term that we use for it is in North America between about 1500 and 1600, in that century between Columbus and between Europeans arriving in North America. There was that decimation, right? 90% death. And the peoples that remained kind of came together to form new nations, new tribes, with new names. I'll give you a break for a second if you want to take care of your plates. That's fine with me. Yeah, I'll do that. That way everybody can hear. We're about halfway, maybe a little more than halfway.